Mr. Chair and members, House Bill 2473 prohibits the state, a political subdivision, or an agency, board, commission, or department from entering into a contract of $100,000 or more with a company to acquire or dispose of services, supplies, information technology, or construction unless the contract includes a written certification that the company does not and will not discriminate against a firearm entity. A public entity may not adopt a procurement, investment, or other policy that has the effect of inducing or requiring a person or company to discriminate against a firearm entity, and the bill defines discriminate as refusing to engage in the trade of any goods or services, refraining from continuing an existing business relationship, terminating an existing business relationship, or otherwise discriminating against a person. Mr. Chair, there is one amendment I'd be happy to explain.
Yes, please.
Mr. Chair, the three-page amendment in Senator Livingston's name dated March 24th, 2022 at 9:18 a.m. applies the contract requirements to contracts entered into after the effective date and removes a trade association from the definition of firearm entity, redefines trade association as a firearm trade association, and applies the contract requirement and prohibition to a firearms trade association. The amendment specifies that a public entity complies with the written certification requirement by including a company's submitted certification as part of the procurement process. The prohibition on a public entity entering into a contract without a written certification does not apply if the public entity does not receive a responsive bid from any company that is able to provide the written certification, and does not apply to a contract that is a sole source contract. The amendment redefines ammunition, firearm, and firearm accessory, and excludes a political subdivision that operates a federal reclamation project from the definition of public entity. The amendment modifies the definition of discriminate by specifying that refusing, refraining from, or terminating a business relationship with a firearm entity or firearm trade association must have been based solely on its status as a firearm entity or firearm trade association. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? All right. Thank you. Representative Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. For the record, I'm Representative Frank Carroll from former District 22, now District 28. And I want to thank you for hearing the bill. I also want to thank Senator Livingston for carrying the amendment to this bill. The staff did a great job describing the bill in detail, so I won't belabor it because I have some great witnesses here to attest to the fact that we have a reason for this bill. And some of those named, like Michael Findlay is here from National Shooting Sports Foundation. I have Timothy Loney from Ruger, and I also have Cheryl Todd here. There's a few others that may be signed in as well. The point to this whole bill is the fact that the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and the Arizona Article 2, Section 26, that we all swore an oath to uphold and defend, are being addressed with this. Agencies should not be engaged in promoting or supporting the kind of conduct that would infringe or interfere or impair these amendments and interfere with lawful commerce. I'm not telling a particular private sector job industry that they cannot have a position for, pro, or against. The point here is that government will not be engaged in this, and I think the amendment makes it most reasonable under the circumstances we could possibly encounter. So with that, I'll open it for questions, or if you'd like to go right to the witnesses so we understand the impetus behind this.
Would you, well, yeah, we got a question here. Yes.
Yeah, thank you,
Certainly,
Mr.
Mr.
Rich. Thank you, Mr. Carroll, for bringing this forward. We have a number of speakers. I would ask you on the for side, pick three. Those speaking against the bill, pick three, and you'll have a minute and a half.
Okay, give me 1 second. I'll make that
I
arrangement.
understand. Thank you.
Some Jeopardy music.
My three lucky contestants are, okay, be Michael Findlay from NSSF. He does have a flight to catch, but I'd like to get him up first. Timothy Loney from Ruger, and I'd also like Cheryl Todd to speak.
Say
for
those
the
three
bill.
again.
Three.
Kimmy Shirley.
Last names?
Which one you want?
I've got the.
He's got it?
I got
Never
it.
mind.
I got it.
Okay, we got
Mr.
it.
Findlay,
Thank you, sir.
welcome to Senate Appropriations. Please introduce yourself. Tell us who you're representing, and you have a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Michael Findlay. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the National Shooting Sports Foundation. We're the National Trade Association for America's firearm manufacturers, ammo manufacturers, retailers, and ranges. And I'm here to speak to you on a very important issue. We have rampant discrimination against the financial industry, from the financial industry on the firearms industry, not only nationally, but here in Arizona. And two folks are going to come in just in a second and give you specific examples on that. But I want to give you a little bit of context and a little bit of history about this issue and why this bill is so important. Over 13 years ago, during the Obama administration, there was an operation that they called Choke Point. And the Obama administration could not stop the Second Amendment legislatively. So they decided to work through the regulators, FDIC and others, to classify entire industries, including ours, as quote-unquote high risk.
30 seconds, please.
What ended up happening is these legacy programs are still on the books, and banks have been disincentivized to do business with the firearms industry. And again, we're going to have some examples in just a moment. You'll also hear some of the banks say that this is a free market issue. That's not true. It's disingenuous at best. In fact, don't take my word for it, or don't take the bank's word for it, but many of you know who the Mercatus Institute is. They are the
final
free
thoughts,
enterprise
please.
think tank that matches public policy with action. They have studied this issue.
Sir, your
and they
time
have
has
said-
expired.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have, oh, you have a question? Yes.
Yes, I would, Mr. Chair, may I ask?
You may ask.
I would like to hear about the Mercatus Institute, one of my favorites. Can you finish your thought on that?
Wonderful. And if you are a free market.
Sir.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, Chair, Senator, I apologize about that. The Mercatus Institute is a free market think tank in Washington, D.C., and it marries free market policies with public policy. They've studied this issue extensively, and I can send you a white paper on it in which they've supported our side. So again, I'm going to come up here and say, this is not a free market issue, and then you're going to have the opponents say, this is a free market institute. I'm asking you to not trust myself or the opponents, but trust the Mercatus Institute as the premier gold standard on free market public policy, I would say legislation in this country. Additionally, ALEC, who's a very respected public policy think tank, is making model legislation very similar for the energy industry, what you're seeing here today. This does not tell a business what they can and cannot do. This simply says that Arizona can choose themselves to do business with people that have their values or don't have the values of Arizonans. So that's really what this bill is. Thank you, Senator, for the question, Chair.
Any questions? Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Caprosi. Welcome to Senate Appropriations. Jay, please introduce yourself. Tell us who you're representing. You have a minute and a half, please.
Mr. Chairman and members, my name is Jay Caprosi, here today on behalf of the Arizona Bankers Association in opposition to 2473. Let me first start by thanking Mr. Carroll, who is always a gentleman, and he's been a gentleman on this bill as well. Yet we strongly disagree. We strongly disagree on a number of points. One is this is clearly not an infringement on the Second Amendment. There has been no examples that have been provided in which there is an entity that has been unable to get banking. There's been no examples that have been provided to suggest that it would be the appropriate role of government to interfere in this space, because the only time in which that would be appropriate is in which a circumstance in which an industry has a monopoly. That is not the case here. There have been examples that have been provided in the past that have suggested that that there was discrimination that went on against an individual business or one or another. As we dig into those, what we come to find is they all have a bank. Many of them have several banks because of the scale in which they are. And without that, we don't have a problem to solve. Therefore, there isn't a solution to fix. It is clearly an infringement upon the operations of a private business in which there has not been any monopoly issue or sustained as part of that. So we do feel that this bill is not ripe for consideration here, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions?
Mr. Chair. Oh,
Yes, Senator Bowie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, Mr. Caprosi. Let's talk about free market. We just had a speaker come up and say this was not a free market issue. I mean, it sounds a lot to me like government saying to political subdivisions, telling them what they can or can't do in terms of contracts. It seems to go against this less government, more freedom, free market philosophy I hear about a lot here. So can you respond to the comments that the last speaker made about the free market?
Rosie.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bowie, members. This bill clearly states that you will no longer be able to pursue certain business if, in fact, that you are making business decisions that are in the best interest of your business. It's interesting that on one hand, banks get beat up as for-profit enterprises, yet when we get to this point in time, we seem to forget that banks, their role is to go pursue profit. And so these are business decisions that they're making, and this does make an infringement upon that because it will no longer allow you then to pursue other business opportunities.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One more question. Mr. Caprosi, you had mentioned this in your initial statement as far as whether entities in Arizona this is actually happening to. I mean, it seems to me, in looking over it, that it's a solution in search of a problem. Do you know of any entities in Arizona where this has been the case, where folks have been discriminated against previously?
Rosie.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bowie, we have searched high and low trying to find circumstances in which there is a firearms business or a rampant set of firearms businesses that are going without a bank and going without a banking relationship, and we've been unable to find any. Banks may have made business decisions in order, as they would with any particular industry, to either address a loan or business based on creditworthiness, based on any number of factors in which they, in a free market, have the freedom to choose. We haven't found those. We've had there's been anecdotal statements that have been made about individual firearms companies of some sort losing a business relationship, but what is left out of that circumstance is the availability of banking elsewhere. We have a very robust banking environment in Arizona. Apologize that we weren't able to have bankers here. We had at least one on deck earlier this morning who could speak to those issues. We have rural banks, urban banks. We've got all kinds of banks ready, willing, and able to serve the needs of the firearms industry.
Yes.
Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
Livingston and Senator Townsend.
Jay, I noticed in your opening and your questions, you've been very careful how you phrase things. As a true professional, I would expect no less. But I want you to clarify, because unable to get a bank is very different than being rejected from a bank. So are you aware of anybody, since we had this testimony in Finance Committee last week, that were rejected by a bank and had to go find a new bank because of the business they're doing in this regarding the Second Amendment?
Mr.
Caprosi?
Chairman and Mr. Livingston, I'm certain that I can provide you a list of businesses in every industry who have been turned down by a bank for one reason or another. And I'm not here arguing that there aren't firearms businesses that have either had a banking relationship that has ceased or that has not been entered into. What I'm very clear to make to you all is that is the right of a business. Your business, the banking business, any other business, to make those decisions that are in the best interest of their business. However, I'm also making it very clear, it is only an appropriate role of government, maybe in my humble opinion and backed by kind of basic free market principles, that it's only appropriate for the legislature and government to bring in the heavy hand of government only in a circumstance in which it's been demonstrated that there's a monopoly in place or that there is no reasonable access to those services. That is not the case, and in none of the testimony, we've heard testimony on this bill quite a few times, and in none of that testimony has anyone brought forth a circumstance in which there is a firearms business that has been unable to enter into a banking
But Mr. Chairman,
relationship.
to my point,
Yes, Senator
and you
Livingston.
stated that 4 times, but I need
Sorry.
I need you to be able to say that there has been firearm dealers that have to close their banking relationship because of the type of business they're are in, firearms. And if you want to add the comma and say they were able to go get to another bank, I'm happy to do that. But I think it's important that you admit and the committee hears that it has happened in Arizona, that banking relationships have been severed just based on the relationship of firearms.
Mr. Caprosi?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I don't think we're running from that. I think we have stated that there are banks that have ceased a relationship for one reason or another with the firearms industry, comma, however, they have all been able to ultimately access banking. And in those
And
circumstances
Mr.
in which-
Caprosi,
Yes, sir.
what'd they do? Did they offer them to go to another bank? They say, well, you have this bank to go to or that bank? Or did they just deny them?
Mr. Chairman and members, they accessed a basic open market for banking that's available, and went to another bank that maybe didn't have some of those same policies in place. Again, we have a very robust banking industry. If there's a firearms business that's looking for a bank, let us know.
Thank you, Mr. Caprosi. Senator Townsend?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Caprosi. You had said earlier that the bank ought to be able to make those decisions if it's affecting the bottom line or I think you used the word profit. Can you describe to me how banking with someone who's involved in Second Amendment activities costs the bank profit?
Mr. Caprosi?
Mr. Chairman and Ms. Townsend, I think ultimately when you're looking at any industry that's out there, you're going to make a decision about whether you're going to look at the creditworthiness of the bank, you're going to look at the reputation of the entity that's out there, you're going to make decisions about the mix of your deposits versus your deposit relationships, you're going to look at circumstances in which what is the mix of your bank, where is your exposure at, what collateral is being put forward, et cetera. Banking is a matter of assessing risk. And so as we look at all of the data that's available, they make a decision ultimately about what's in the best interest of that bank.
Yes, Senator.
To be clear, it is not discrimination. Arizona and federal law have very extensive laws managing the banking industry around
Thank you, Mr.
discrimination.
Caprosi. That's why we're here. We know that.
Okay.
Senator Townsend?
So, thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Caprosi. So if the bank was making a decision to not do, and I'm not talking about, other practices about business itself, but if they're making a decision to not engage in business with a company that has dealings with the Second Amendment for that purpose, do you have any data that shows that having Second Amendment activities becomes some kind of business risk to a bank?
Mr. Caprosi?
Mr. Chairman and Ms. Townsend, I don't have that data at my fingertips.
Okay,
What
so
I-
Mr. Chair, because we're trying to stay close. So because if there's no data, I'm just curious if there is, to make a business decision that we're not going to give an account to a business that is dealing with items that has to do with the Second Amendment because of some kind of business risk, but there's no data showing that it is a business risk, it then becomes an opinion. And I think that is discrimination. That's all I wanted to say.
Mr. Chairman and members, discrimination is
That's fine. Mr. Caprosi, any other questions of it so we can move on? Are you guys good? Thank you, Mr. Vice
Yeah,
Chair. Thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman, we're going to
Thank you.
have, and I didn't catch last names, but Tim from Ruger. Welcome to Senate Appropriations, where we all get along 24/7. Please introduce yourself, tell us who you're representing, and you have a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee members.
Could you speak a little closer to the mic?
Sure. My name is Tim Lowney. I'm a Vice President of Operations for the Ruger Firearms. We're a manufacturer that has a big facility in Arizona. We have over 400 employees that are citizens of Arizona, and they make a living working at our factory, and they support their families, and they support the local economies. We have an example of discrimination from the banking industry. We had a relationship with Bank of America for decades and their predecessor banks. And a couple of years ago, they told us they would no longer do business with us because we were in the firearms industry. We were able to find another bank, but now that bank's starting to say the same thing. It was not based on any banking risks. We have a very, very strong balance sheet. We have virtually zero debt. Our suppliers want to do business with us because we pay our bills on time, we pay our taxes.
30 seconds, sir.
So we are for this bill.
You have a question?
I do.
Yes, sir.
So, Tim, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your last name.
Lowney.
Leone, thank you for coming and sharing some time with us. Was that a written document, or was that verbal, or how did that transaction happen?
I'm not in finance, so I don't know that, but I could
No,
find that.
that's what I just
Yeah,
wanted to.
Mr. Vice Chair.
Mr. Chairman, just wanted to know how that all happened. Mr. Chairman, and
Yes,
then
sir.
Tim, the follow-up question is, so what's happening with your current banking relationship?
Mr. Lowney?
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman, currently our current bank is now starting to tell us the same thing, that they're going to end the relationship potentially because of the fact that we're in the firearms industry.
So,
Yes,
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Vice
Tim,
Chair.
I guess I need to have further definition whether I mean, isn't it either you is or you ain't? Pay off are they giving you time? Or what are they doing? How is this discussion going, if you can share that? If it's confidential, I understand.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
and again, I'm not in the finance department. I just know that we're at risk of losing the second bank.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Tim.
Senator Borelli?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Sir, do you know of any other companies, firearm industry related in Arizona, that are running into the same problem? If you-
Mr. Lowney?
Chairman, Senator Borelli, I don't know specifically, but our salespeople tell us that dealers are suffering the same fate. And it's a much more critical to a dealer because, unlike us with a sound balance sheet, they need that capital to run their business.
Senator Livingston? No. Thank you, Mr. Lowney.
Thank you.
All right. Paul, Mr. Paul, or Miss Paul? Some
We
Paul?
looking for the next speaker?
Yes.
You won't
Hey,
find him
Paul.
on there because he needs to fill out a white sheet, and that's Paul. Jay, you're getting your... Welcome, Paul.
Oh.
They'll give you a sheet to fill out after you've completed. But welcome to Senate Appropriations. Please introduce yourself, tell us who you're representing, and you have a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Paul Hickman. I am the president and CEO of the Arizona Bankers Association, and I am rising today in opposition to this measure. And I don't want to rehash a lot of ground that Mr. Caprosi plowed. I would like to respond to something that Mr. Findlay said about Operation Choke Point. The banking industry was equally incensed at Operation Choke Point, and we raised that at the federal level and at the state level where appropriate. We would do that no matter what the industry is. We believe business in the United States ought to have the right to do business the way they see fit. And if they want to discriminate, as long as they're not breaking a banking law or any other law against discrimination with respect to race, gender, age, nationality, or other, they ought to be able to do that. They ought to be able to run their business any way they see fit. And so the last point I want to make is I would urge the committee to be careful and look at what the state might lose from doing this. The state has a land trust with about $7.6 billion in it that I'm aware of. They also have essentially a checking account with about $8 billion in it. And changing a bank is not something that the state or a public entity, a county, a city or town can do overnight. It
30
takes
seconds,
time and it
please.
takes money. And I'll leave it at that and take questions if there are any. Thank you for the opportunity.
Senator Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
My name is Paul Hickman.
Paul
Hickman.
Hickman.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you in eggs as well?
I am not.
Okay.
For
Good.
no lack of trying
Good.
to get into that family.
He's in banking.
The free
He's
range
the
thing
other
going
side.
on lately.
I
so.
do keep their eggs in my fridge, though, because I like seeing my name
I
on
don't.
my eggs.
I do
Sorry.
not. Anyway, can you describe to me, Mr. Chair and Mr. Hickman, what risks are involved when a bank does business with a company who otherwise has excellent accounting and business practices but happens to be dealing in firearms? What risk is that to the bank?
Well, there's Mr. Chair, Senator Townsend, members of the committee, thank you. There are a variety of risks that, as Mr. Caprosi alluded to, that a bank weighs. One is reputation risk. Another could be the risk of foreclosure. And in the case of a firearms industry, there are plenty of banks that do not want to take possession of guns and ammo. They don't have any history of doing that. They have no expertise with that. And that's not an inventory that they want to take possession of. It's very similar to the marijuana industry. There are a lot of banks that do not want to bank that industry. There are plenty of banks that do want to bank that industry.
To
I
that
won't change
point,
the
Mr.
subject.
Chairman.
Have a
But
point.
I hope
Mr.
that helps.
Mr. Vice Chair. yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Hick, I understand that banks aren't in the ammo business and the gun business, but you're not in the bicycle business, and you're not in the farm equipment business, and there's a number of business that you're not involved in, but there are brokers that are. So I understand that you don't want to take that inventory over. I can appreciate that, but there are a whole host of other activities that you have no knowledge of, and you look at a P&L and you look at history. In my humble, I used to be in agriculture, capital goods agriculture. You certainly didn't want to take a farm full of harvesters over at $70,000 apiece and try to run a dairy operation.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Leach, thank you for the example. There are a lot of banks that would not want to take that farm equipment for those reasons, for those exact reasons. They don't have that expertise, and therefore they may pass on that piece of business. It's not their niche.
But Mr. Chairman.
still on the point?
Mr. Hickman.
Yes, sir.
Yes. They decided not to take it. Ensuring my farm and my structures, and all of a sudden telling me we're not going to do business anymore, just because I'm having a problem there.
Senator Townsend, you
Thank
finish
you.
your-
Just to follow up what you had said on the part A of that A and B example, you talked about the risk to the reputation. Can you elaborate on that and let us know how dealing with the firearms industry is going to damage the reputation of the bank?
Mr. Hickman?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Townsend, thank you. I think that banks want to make those decisions themselves. And if a bank, like in the case of Sig Sauer, which Mr. Findlay alluded to, maybe not in his testimony, but in earlier testimony on this bill, they lost one of their banks. They lost Berkshire Bank in the wake of the Orlando shooting because the Orlando shooter who killed 49 people used one of their products. One of their 6 banks at the time said, we don't think that we want to do business with you anymore. For that reason, that was perfectly fine. They didn't lose access to banking. They had 5 other banks.
Well,
that it?
Mr.
Nope.
Hickman, let me ask you this. So we quit doing business with Walmart because they have bats and people use bats on the street?
Mr. Chairman, no, I don't think we would do that, but I do think that Walmart, which may be a state vendor as well.
Sir, you know that what it is. It's because there's an issue, political issue about guns or not in this country. Not about bats or not, even though there are more deaths by other instruments than there are guns. And so the issue here, I think you're pushing, and that's angering a lot of people who like their constitutional rights, is our banks deciding whether a business can live or not, because you're not going to be able to live these days without a bank. And imagine if all the banks just decide, you know what, we're just going to side with this issue in a political realm, and we're going to crush this industry. And that's the major fear here.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I appreciate that. And you're exactly right. This is a political issue. and it is a solution in search of a problem, as
Yeah.
Senator Bowie alluded to earlier today. Because the issue that you just described, the hypothetical that you just put forward, does not exist. The gun industry has access to the banking
But
system
you
in
just
the United
showed
States.
that it did. You just said it did in Orlando. So I'm giving you another example of the same fact, but they don't get rid of the bat companies. And that's the fact that I'm giving you.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have an example of someone getting rid of a bat company. That may
That's
exist.
my point.
Yeah,
You're
that may
making my
exist.
point, yes. Let Senator Townsend
Thank
finish
you. I
up
have, Mr.
first.
Chair, I just have a short question. This has been fun. Can you give me an example of a time in history when banks may have told certain people that they weren't going to be doing business with them because they didn't like those people? Has that ever happened in history, and what's happened to protect those people?
Well, I
Mr.
think
Hickman.
probably during the Jim Crow
Mr.
era.
Hickman.
Mr.
Mr. Hickman,
Chairman, I
thank you.
apologize.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Senator Townsend, I think probably that did happen. Probably, and I can think of during the Jim Crow era, maybe, and it may have happened in other eras as well.
And
in other
Mr. Chair,
countries.
Mr. Hickman,
Yes,
would you agree that
Senator.
that was wrong and that we should have fixed that by protecting them?
We did fix that.
Yes.
And I do,
Okay.
and I
Mr.
do agree
Hickman.
that that was wrong. I'm sorry,
Okay.
Mr.
So I
Mr.
imagine,
Chairman, I
Mr. Chair,
apologize.
that you understand my analogy.
Senator.
Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry?
Mr. Chair and Mr. Hickman, I imagine you understand my analogy and that people deserve to be protected if they're being discriminated against because of political wins and the majority of, whatever. I think that this is another time we face in history where we have to make that decision if we are going to allow this kind of discrimination based on a political opinion of a group of people. And I like the direction this bill's taken us. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Townsend, if they were being discriminated
Mr.
maybe
Hickman.
by the banking industry because they're in the firearms industry, meaning they cannot access a bank, maybe, but that is not the case.
Mr. Chair, can I please?
Yes.
I imagine that same thing was told to persons that were being discriminated against, that you can find, I'm sure there's a bank that will take you, but our bank will not. I just don't buy that argument. I think it's discrimination. I don't think that anybody's presented any evidence today that shows that there is any kind of significant risk to the bank to do business with we've heard testimony from somebody who said we are an excellent customer, we've paid all our bills, financially we're fantastic, but it's because we're dealing with firearms, we've lost our accounts. I haven't heard anything that justifies the decision by the bank to discriminate against them. If there's some kind of study you can point to or any kind of analysis, but so far we haven't heard that today, other than we don't want to have to touch the guns if we have to acquire them. I mean, I could kind of understand that, but I'm sure there's methodology to handle that situation. Anyway. So I just am not convinced, and I don't think there's any kind of solid reasoning that we need to discriminate against people because of the type of business they're in.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Townsend, and again, I would
Yes,
say
Mr. Hickman.
excuse me.
Yes.
And again, I would say they're not being discriminated against. They can get a bank. Mr. Laone from Ruger has a bank. He said that they're talking about discontinuing the relationship, but he couldn't answer your questions as to why.
But I will
But
just,
to that
Mr.
point,
Chair,
Mr.
we will
Chairman.
just point back to the Jim Crow days. Those people could get a bank somewhere, so that's not discrimination. I just think we're really beating this to the point where it's getting sad. I think we should
Yes.
stop. I think
You
we
have a-
should stop.
You have a point?
Yeah,
Yes.
I do have a point. You could ride on the bus as long as you ride on the back of the bus. If you wanted to ride in front of the bus, you couldn't ride it. That's discrimination. You could still get a ride to point A or point B or point C, but you had to do it in the back of the bus. That's discrimination. You could get a drink of water out of the black fountain, but you dasn't take a drink out of the white fountain. That's discrimination. Discrimination happens, it's not because you can go someplace else, in my opinion. You may have a different view of that, and I appreciate that. But telling people they have to go to the back of the bus, telling them that they can't drink out of a white man's fountain is discrimination.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Hickman.
Senator Leach, I appreciate that. And I think conflating this with racial discrimination or Title VII discrimination is completely
Oh,
different. It
excuse
has
me.
nothing
This
to
is
do with-
constitutional discrimination. This is Constitution.
Mr. Chairman, it is the Constitution, but the last time I checked, the firearms industry did not have a constitutional right to do anything. I don't know where they are in the Constitution, and I can't find a
They're in the
case.
Second Amendment.
Oh, it shall not be
With
infringed.
that, I have Mr. Borelli and then Mr. Livingston and then Mr. Bowie.
Thank you,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Chairman. Credit card transactions are part of the banking system, correct, sir?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
Senator
Hickman.
Borelli, yes, sir.
So is like e-banking,
Senator.
Mr. Chairman, sir, so is the e-banking transactions, that's part of the banking industry, correct?
Mr. Chairman, it is part of the banking industry, yes.
So, Mr.
Senator.
Chairman, sir, are you aware of, there's a lot of dealers that are out there and some manufacturers that their customers are they're actually being discriminated, let me phrase this right. They're having so much opposition and obstruction where now they cannot even do business through credit card transactions and even e-transactions through banking. Now, they may still have a bank account, but the banks have been obstructing all this, restricting, so that way they cannot do commerce.
Mr. Chairman, Senator
Yes,
Borelli, I'm
Mr.
not
Hickman.
aware of that. And I represent 200,000 banking employees here in the state of Arizona, and I would be happy to look into that for you. If you can give me the name of a constituent that has had that problem and the name of their bank, I'll run it to ground.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
And, sir, I will. Start with the B of A and Chase.
And can you tell me who your constituents
I
are?
will not say that on the
Mr.
air.
Hickman
I will
and
talk-
Senator, I'm right
I
here.
apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
Thank
Chairman?
you.
Sir, I will meet you offline and talk, because I don't want to do it here.
Mr. Chairman,
'Cause- And
Senator
he'll give
Borelli.
you a list.
Mr. Hickman.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Borelli, thank you.
But, Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator.
and sir, you made the other point that, you know, that the government shouldn't be doing this or hasn't been doing this. The federal government's doing this now. They're controlling by using government control on private industry such as the energy industry, the farming industry, and our medical industry. They're putting so much government control and restrictions that if you do certain things, then they're going to shut you down and would threaten you with government contracts, so on and so forth. That, sir, when you have government interfering and imposing their will on with private businesses to impose their will on the people, that's called fascism.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Borelli, I
Mr.
couldn't
Hickman.
agree more,
Thank
which is
you.
why I
That's
would
all I need
urge
to hear.
you
That's it. Thank
in
you.
the most strenuous way not to take that government action against private industry.
And that's what you guys are doing. Thank you.
Yes, Senator Livingston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Hickman, thank you for being here. We've had many meetings over the years, and I listened to you very closely on your opening statements, and I'd like to ask you two questions on that. One, you stated, that we have over $8 billion in state money in a checking account, which is pretty accurate, which is a good thing. But then you made a reference of be careful if you restrict banking access to the state by making changes. Why do you think, what impact would that have on the state of Arizona if we couldn't do business with Bank of America or Wells Fargo?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Borelli, thank you for the question. I just take it back to simple economics 101. If you have constant demand and you reduce supply, you put upward pressure on price. That's what will happen here. If you discriminate against half of the banks that are doing business with the state, the other half are going to be able to react by putting upward pressure on price, which redounds to the detriment of our taxpayers.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hickman, I agree with you 100%. So how do you think Ruger feels about the same thing?
Mr. Hickman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Livingston, I'm not sure how Ruger feels about it. I understand that Mr.
Well, sir,
Leone, I'm
the
sorry.
point is,
Yes,
we both
Senator.
agree, Mr. Chairman, that if the state can't do business with big business and we restrict them, the state would have to pay higher fees because we would have to go to other things. Logic speaks that Ruger has to go through the same process every time one of their banking institution closes on them and they have to go to another bank. Isn't that normal economics?
Mr.
Hickman.
Chairman, Senator Livingston, yes, it is
Okay.
normal economics, and it would impact the state taxpayers if that decision were made here. And my point was, we have an obligation to protect them to the extent that we can.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
and again, I agree with you, and I'm happy that you want to protect the state, but I think the exact same argument is we have to protect rigor for the same reason and for the same economics. But let me ask a different question.
Okay,
Because I
Senator.
think, Mr. Chairman, the real issue here is why are we having this discussion? And I think you may have insight that very few people would have, and I would hope you would share that. And what I want you to talk about, sir, is what type of federal rules and regulations have been coming down the last few years that are causing the banks in your association to change their underwriting guidelines and how and who they work with. Explain what pressure our Arizona banks are under to maintain their FDIC insurance and working with the federal government. If they cannot do that, they cannot even operate as a bank. So if you could approach it from that point of view, I think every member here would be interested to know that.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
Senator
Hickman.
Livingston, I appreciate the question. I'm not aware that there's federal pressure that makes it more difficult to bank a firearms entity as opposed to any other entity. And I'll take your point. The banking industry in the United States is one of the most highly regulated industries there is, beyond transportation, potentially the nuclear industry. But in recent years, I am not aware of any new rules or regulations coming down from any of the federal bank regulators that make it more difficult to do business with a firearms entity.
Mr.
Yes,
Chairman, so
Senator.
if there's no pressure on changing underwriting, are they encouraging banks doing business with firearms?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
Senator
Hickman.
Livingston, they're encouraging banks to do business in a safe and sound and secure and prudential manner.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
so this is
Senator.
not a banking decision. This is not a financial decision. These banks are making these determinations strictly based on their political views. And in your opinion, they should be able to make those political decisions. Is that accurate?
Mr.
Mr.
Hickman.
Chairman, Senator Livingston, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page and I heard you properly. Thank you for being so honest. I appreciate that.
Mr. Bowie? No. Mr. Vice Chair? Thank you, Mr. Hickman. Oh, I did not know you were.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Senator Alston.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hickman, it's good to see you. It's been a few years. I haven't served on a committee that you have been testifying before. It's good to see you, and I apologize for your time with us today being so difficult. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Alston, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you.
Mr. Hickman. I'm not as pleased as her, just so you know. So, but thank you, Senator Alston.
One last
Mr. Vice
speaker-
Chair, yes.
One last speaker, we have Cheryl.
Thank you, Mr. Hickman.
Cheryl Todd.
Thank you, members.
Thank you, Mr. Hickman. Welcome back. Cheryl, please introduce yourself. Tell us who you're representing, and you have a minute and a half.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senators, my name is Cheryl Todd. I'm a wife, a mom, and a grandma. I'm also the Arizona Director to the DC Project, Women, dedicated to safeguarding the Second Amendment and our right to keep and bear arms. And I am also a business owner, specifically in the firearm industry, and have been for many years. Thank you for the opportunity to support HB2473, this important anti-discrimination bill. The very fact that the banks do not want to sign a promise to not discriminate is enough to tell me that this bill is not only appropriate, but needed. The banks sit in their lofty offices and virtue signal down to the rest of us that they are too moral and high-standing to get their hands dirty by working with me and with many other decent, responsible, law-abiding men and women in one of the most highly regulated and constitutionally protected industries. The items we sell are legal, life-saving tools of hunting, sporting,
30
and
seconds,
self-defense.
please.
Our customers are responsibly armed citizens who, it is well documented, save lives 2.5 million times each year with those life-saving tools of self-defense. The banks are clearly saying that my kind can just go find our loans, credit card processing, and financial services elsewhere. And I suppose we can sit at the back of the bus while we're keeping to our side of the tracks. Those of us who have experienced bigotry and discrimination firsthand, like I have, understand the clever word games that the banks are using. And if the banks can continue to discriminate against one legal industry, they will discriminate
thoughts,
against
please.
others, and likely are. And this is why I am imploring you to represent your constituents and not the banks and support HB2473, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions? Senator Brawley.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ma'am, so could you please explain to me what business you were referring to? What problems were you having transaction-wise, all that stuff?
So my husband and
Todd.
I were, sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Chairman, Senator Borelli. My husband and I have been in the firearms business for about 20 years. We had a freestanding corner mom and pop shop called AZ Firearms for many years. We closed it just about the time that the results of the last election came around because we have already lived through very intense regulations, and we just assumed there would be more coming. On the banking issue, we have specifically had issues with credit card processing, just flat out being told no. We won't do business with you in this capacity. We also have an auction house, and so there's these two different things that are warring with each other sometimes with the regulations of the credit card processors. We actually had a credit card processor call us while we were trying to complete a transaction on some ammo that we were selling to a federally regulated firearms range. And the person on the other end of the phone said, "We will not release your funds to you until you give us an itemized list of what was sold to that entity." This never happens. That is discrimination. That is harassment. That is time wasting. We had a long-standing relationship with Chase Bank, and just about the time that Operation Choke Point was happening, we didn't know what was happening. We were just feeling the results of it. We were in the same bank, making the same deposits every single day, interacting with the staff there, and suddenly we had to go through a series of paperwork that we had to fill out in order to make the same deposits that we had been making, to the point that my husband finally had a conversation with the bank manager and said, "It's almost like you guys don't want us here anymore." And the bank manager affirmed that and said, "Yes, we think it would be better if you took your business elsewhere." Nothing else had changed. Nothing else had changed other than this pressure coming down from the federal government through this Operation Choke Point. That is part of the culture now. It has seeped into the culture of these organizations. And I will say that this isn't my research. I got it from Dave Kopp, who's here. He said that he researched last night that the top 15 banks in our nation control 50% of the market. So I do have to search for the banks I go to. I have to search for the credit card processor companies that I am acceptable to. And it is very time consuming. And when you are a small business, time is money exponentially. I thank you for your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, Senator Borelli.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ma'am, so those were through basically e-transactions, electronic transactions, credit cards, so on and so forth. Did you have this kind of a challenge with cash?
So the challenge with cash is, and it still continues, that if there's so much cash that you're depositing, even if it's the same amount of deposits that you bring in, you have to document it and justify it. Well, the justification should be, this is my business, and this is the same level of deposit that we make ordinarily. What I can't speak to is that more so or less so because of the nature of the items I'm selling. That I can't speak to. But the fact that the banks have these turnstiles that you have to go through in order to just transact it's onerous on our time, our attention, and the amount that we can give to our staff and our clients and customers.
Mr. Chair, to that point, when I in my business, when I was dealing with large amounts of cash, I had to go through all kinds of hoops, fill all kinds of forms because it's all about cash, and they highly encourage to go to electronic type of banking system. Now that we're into that electronic banking system, now they got more control over you, and now they can control everything. They can cut you off. They can just freeze your funds.
Exactly.
It's time to go back to the barter system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Mr. Vice Chair.
Mr. Chairman, ready to move a bill?
Please move
Oh,
a bill.
wait a minute. What about the sponsor?
Does Mr. Carroll need to say anything?
I think everybody said everything, that Mr. Chairman, that they needed to say. I think the bill's ready to be moved. Please do so.
All right,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Vice Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I move that House Bill 2473 be returned with a due pass recommendation. Mr. Chairman, I move the Livingston three-page amendment dated March 24th, 2022 at 9:18 a.m. be adopted.
All right, members heard that motion. Those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Appears the ayes have it, do have it, so ordered. Mr. Vice Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I move that House Bill 2473 as amended be returned with a due pass recommendation.
All right, members heard that motion. Madam Secretary.
Senator Alston? No. Senator Brawley?
Mr. Chairman, may I explain my vote?
No.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is gonna,
All right, go ahead.
Said no.
Go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm gonna be this is gonna be a lot of fun on the floor. I'm gonna have a good time. I vote aye. You guys.
Senator Bowes?
No.
Senator Kerr?
Aye.
Senator Livingston?
Aye.
Senator Tondo? No. Senator Tron? Nay. Senator Townsend?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I think this is a good time to pause and think about, how do I put this? How we have selective outrage over discrimination. That we are outraged with certain kinds of discrimination, but we are willing to support discrimination if it's against the people we don't like, if it's against the people that we don't agree with, if it's against the people who are doing things and promote things that we disagree with. Selective outrage is a dangerous thing. It's dangerous. And if we don't point at it and say it's wrong, then we are at risk of having it happen again. And when certain people are in charge and have the means and the power to affect their discrimination onto those that they disagree with politically or whatever other reason, and we allow for that to happen, it's a matter of time when human beings, when the shoe is on the other foot, will do it to the other group. At some point, we have to decide that it shouldn't happen under any circumstance, whether we like that person or not. So I think it's time for us as human beings to search our hearts and ask, is discrimination absolute, or are we okay with it under certain circumstances when it happens to our enemies? This is one of those times when we are faced with that. And if you are okay with discrimination against your enemies because you don't like them or something political that they do, you should be ashamed of yourself. And with that, I vote aye.
Senator Leach?
May I explain my vote?
Yes.
Members, I would like to tell you that this is the last bill that we'll hear along these lines. Unfortunately, it's not. We have, and we can point to both sides. There's enough blame in the topic that I'm going to talk about to go around this room several times. But we're entering an era, and maybe we've been there. Going back to my history major, maybe it was the same as the Civil War era when the press took over and was belligerent. But where I'm going is that we've had a number of bills already today that venture into areas on our rights as individuals. I respect and agree with Ms. Townsend's view, but somehow our society, and this is bigger than this room, somehow our society has to come to grips with, we lived for years and years and years with guns and ammunition. We lived through, as terrible as it was, and I referred to it earlier, segregation and the racism that followed it. And now we're seeing different forms of racism coming forward. This is not good for our country. It's not good for us individually. It's not good for our country, not good for our state. And I'm torn, as you heard my testimony last week, on two sides of the issue, the free market issue, but potential, and as we heard, outright racism, I think, or discrimination at least, against certain individuals. And so it's not an easy decision that we have pushing a yes or a no button on this particular vote. I was I happen to, we've got another bill coming up this afternoon from Representative Hoffman that goes along these same lines. And from my standpoint, I'm starting to see creeping into our everyday life that if you don't mark the box in the right spot, you're not a good person. And I'm not saying that's on one side or the other. I'm saying that that's across. And that's bothersome to me. And I don't know how to fix it. All I know is that on this particular bill and on the bill that's coming up in a bit, I'm not going to let that go on with my vote, and with that, I vote aye.
Senator Gowan?
Aye.
6 ayes, 4 nays are not voting.
Remember, 6 ayes, 4 nays, 0 not voting. You've given House Bill 2473 as amended a do pass recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I appreciate your support.